thank you for the opportunity to speak at this great university and really is basically our first comment on the debate that will be ensuing over the next several months into the election day about what the budget should look like. What are we about? Who do we stand for? What do we stand for? You know, the United States of America has, and this is not hyperbole, has always done best when the middle class is growing. When the middle class is growing, the wealthy do very well, and we want them to do well. And the poor have a prospect, a ladder up. They have a way out. That's been the history of the journey of this country from the time I sat in the seats that you're sitting in now. Over the past century, the middle class has grew the strength based on the most basic of bargains. We made a basic bargain, and it was one that was shared by Republicans and Democrats for the better part of the last century. The idea was that those who contributed to the prosperity of the nation got to share in that prosperity as well. For a long period of time in our country, people who did the work, the engineers, the craftsmen, the managers, the salesmen, they were considered the job creators. Now, I'm not being sarcastic. They were considered the job creators. They were building the country's economy, right along with the bankers and with the shareholders. There was a consensus among Democrats and Republicans of the basic justice of that bargain and the common belief, and it was a common belief, that a growing middle class provided the greatest stability, social stability, economic stability, political stability, but opportunity for all. But somewhere along the way, and I'm being deadly earnest here, that basic bargain was broken. The new Republican Party changed their mind about that bargain. They adopted an orthodoxy that devalued paychecks. They tilted the tax code in favor of unearned income over earned income, inherited wealth over take-home pay. So look what happened. When I got elected to office as a 29-year-old kid to the Senate in 1973, and I was sworn in, the discrepancy between the salary of the average CEO in America and the lowest paid worker in that company was 22 to 1. Let me say that again. It was 22 to 1. That's a legitimate disparity. The CEO made 22 times as much. Now, today, the average CEO in America makes 273 times as much as the person working on the line. What happened? In 1980, the top 1%, and this is the beginning of the Reagan administration, the top 1% of the wage earners in America took home 10% of the nation's income, all its earnings. By the year 2008, at the end of the Bush administration, the top 1% took home 21% of all the income earned in America. The discrepancy had not been seen since the early 20s, the 1920s. Something fundamental has happened here. And by the way, these wealthy people are not bad people. They're good, loyal, decent Americans. They're as good and as decent as any group of people in America. But something happened here. And the result you may have seen in the New York Times front page headline on April the 23rd this year. It said, and I quote, "The American middle class is no longer the world's wealthiest." The American middle class is no longer the world's wealthiest. And I love Canada, and I love the Canadians. Their middle class is wealthier than the United States of America's middle class. Again, what's going on? What happened? What happened? Folks, we're losing something profound when we break the basic bargain that built this country. We're losing the values that built this nation.
and made us the greatest economic powerhouse in the history of the world. And in my view, this massive shift is being largely, not totally, largely driven by this incredibly narrow mindset that presumes that wealthy investors are the sole drivers of the economy, that all employees work solely by the grace of the shareholders' capital gain. Now think about what I just said. You may not agree with me, but understand what I'm saying. But that's what today's Republican Party is all about. There used to be an ad 20 years ago when they made Oldsmobiles, and they said, "This is not your father's Oldsmobile. This is not your father's Republican Party." I'm not making a moral judgment. I really am not. They're good guys, but they have a fundamentally different view. A fundamentally different view. And the ultimate expression of that view is the budget they just passed in the House of Representatives, which is essentially the same budget that they passed the past 3 years and the one that we litigated in the last presidential race. They say what they value. You listen to the rhetoric. They value all the things we value. Well, my dad used to have an expression, for real. He'd say, when a friend would say, "Let me tell you what I value, Joe," my dad would say, "Show me your budget, and I will tell you what you value." Think about your own lives. What's most important to you is if you reserve what little, probably no income you have right now, you focus on. Your parents, the same way. They obviously value an education at a great university. They wouldn't spend all the money to have you here. That's a value. Someone else may value something else. But so show me your budget. I will tell you what you value, my dad would say. What they clearly value, this new Republican Party, is more tax cuts for the wealthy at the expense of the middle class, because they genuinely, this is not a class argument, because they genuinely believe in their hearts that that's the way in which you build a 21st century economy. Lest you think I'm exaggerating, let me give you some of the specifics. This Republican budget, the so-called Ryan budget, calls for an additional $5.7 trillion in tax cuts. They say they're worried about the deficit, which we've cut by 50%. That's another issue. But all kidding aside, $5.7 trillion in new tax cuts, the vast majority of which goes into the bank accounts of the very wealthy. Ask the very wealthy. They don't need another tax cut. We'd like to be able to give, but they know they don't need another tax cut, for real. They cut the top rate, which we finally got back up to 39%, which was the Bush and Reagan numbers. The Reagan numbers. They cut it to 25%. In fact, nearly $3 trillion of the $5.7 trillion tax cut goes only to people who are making a minimum of $1 million a year. This is a fact. And the impact of this cut would be allow this $87,000 a year tax cut to, on average, for people making over $1 million a year. It has to be paid for. And it delivers a massive blow either to the deficit, or if they don't raise the deficit, how do they pay for it? What gets cut? Well, they find a way. The way they find is to further damage the middle class by raising middle class taxes and eviscerating the programs that most middle class people rely on. They actually raise taxes on middle class families with children. It would vary depending on your exact income and exactly what middle class, but the average, according to the Tax Policy Institute, is people in the middle class tax bracket with children will pay $2,000 a year more in taxes in order to justify an $87,000 a year average tax cut for people making more than $1 million. This isn't about punishing millionaires. This is not I love it when they look at me and they talk about this as class warfare. This isn't class warfare. This is basic economics. Basic economics. And I'm not making this up. According to a study of almost virtually the same plan they did last year, the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, that's where we get the numbers. We have a very different view. We think we should be eliminating extravagant loopholes that exist within, even if you remember, in the debates we had with Mr. Ryan and with Mr. Romney, they said there's $600 million in tax loopholes they could close. Well, there's sure a lot of them, but the one they were going to close with mortgage deductions and a whole range of other things that affect middle-class people. But folks, you have to ask yourself, should someone be paying at 28% when someone is making over $1 billion a year and is paying a 17% tax rate because they, in fact, run a hedge fund? I don't know what that investment it generates. Loopholes for the wealthy. We continue to insist on, they talk about cutting money for alternative energy, yet we keep over a $4 billion tax loophole for oil companies, and they're doing just fine. They're not bad guys either, but they don't need that tax cut right now. So we want to close the loopholes that turn retirement accounts into a chance for the wealthy to accumulate millions of dollars in investments tax-free. Remember that issue during the campaign? We proposed the rule that would ensure that millionaires don't pay a lower tax than any middle-class tax family. What's so irrational about that? Why should we be fighting about that? That used to be an overwhelming consensus in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But they're not interested. They say they value seniors, but they eliminate the Medicare guarantee for everyone turning 55 years old this year and everyone younger. Understand what this does. It eliminates the Medicare guarantee. Now, if you have someone that's been working for over 40 years, basing their retirement on this judgment, it comes as a little bit of a shock. And how do they do it? They have a plan which they say they're going to protect seniors by this voucher plan. A voucher means you get a set amount of money at the front end of the year and told, good luck, Mom, go out and find the best deal you can afford. And by the way, you're no longer guaranteed the same benefits and choices of doctors you get in Medicare today. You can buy back Medicare with a voucher, but there's not going to be enough money to buy back the same benefits. They took some heat for proposing this and voting for it in 2011, and they were very detailed. But this time they don't show the detail, the same deal. But back then, the Congressional Budget Office said it would cost the average senior another $6,400 out of pocket. They care about seniors. When some seniors have only two things they can rely on: Social Security and Medicare. Now they become more vague on the details, so experts can't figure out the exact numbers, and they say they're going to design it in a way to protect seniors, but until they do, I'm assuming they're going to do the same thing. They can correct me. We can debate that if I'm wrong about that, but that's what it has been. They say they're concerned about family with children, yet they propose cutting Medicaid by 1/3 and turning it into a block grant. So they're going to say to the states, we're going to send you 2/3 of the money you get now, and you do with it what you want. Everybody thinks that the impact would only be on the poor. That'd be bad enough. But most people don't know. The middle class relies heavily on Medicaid. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a child with Down syndrome or autism, you rely on Medicaid as a middle class taxpayer. Working class, middle class families rely on Medicaid. So again, disabilities like autism and Down syndrome, they generate a great deal of cost for people. They depend on Medicaid to help pay for the treatment and therapies. According to an independent study, a family with a child who has autism faces an average additional $3,000 a year in medical bills. And by block granting and cutting Medicaid by a third, there's an overwhelming possibility that these families will lose the help they now get from Medicaid, meaning they will shoulder considerably more share of the cost of caring for their children with serious chronic diseases. 21 million people, including families like these, will lose their Medicaid if, in fact, the budget law passes. And by the way, any of you have a grandmom in a nursing home? Or anybody know anybody's a grandmom in a nursing home because your grandpop has probably passed away? The vast majority of the vast majority of people in nursing homes are women. The vast majority of those women are women who have no one else to care for them. Their husbands are passed and their children are not capable, or they have no children. Where are they going to go? Where do they go? What happens to them? This is a reality. I'm not making this up. Ladies and gentlemen, they say they value education for our children. They say they agree with us that the best educated country will seize the day in the 21st century. But yet they cut domestic spending by 15% below our budget. They won't say exactly where they're going to do it, but here's what across-the-board cuts would be, and that's what they've done in the past. So past is prologue, I'm assuming, unless they come up with some new explanation other than the one I'm giving and the one they've given the last 4 years. This would further fracture the basic bargain when it comes to education. We all know the value of early childhood education. Everyone from academia to a leading group of Republican governors are out pushing early education. They not only don't allow that, they in fact cut these programs. They cut everything from Pell Grants at the one end to the other end. They cut, the programs that are designed in Head Start. Everybody knows that all the studies show if you have early education, it significantly increases graduation rates. It keeps people out of the crime and drug stream. It does all these things. There's a consensus on it. They not only won't go for it, they further cut. As well as after-school programs, tutoring programs at every level. The cut will probably mean, if what they're going to do as they did before, they stated what they do before, the numbers are the same. It will mean larger class sizes, less after-school programs, fewer tutors, and they say they value education. They freeze college age, which opened the gate to college for over 2.5 million more students since we've come to office. They say they're committed to making our country and our neighborhoods safe. I don't have to tell anybody other than, and I spent a considerable part of my life dealing with drug policy. You all know of the heroin epidemic that's occurring throughout this country now. You're more informed on it than the vast majority of people who hold public office. Is this the time to cut FBI and DEA by 3,500 personnel? Is this the time to cut support for local law enforcement? Is this the time to lessen the support of federal agencies that are working on not only everything from bank theft, but also terrorism? What are they thinking? We think we should be supporting local law enforcement, and expanding to help the fight against terrorism and street crime. They say they value research and fighting diseases that claim tens of thousands of American lives. Yet, while we're on the very brink of bringing relief to those areas, they cut $4.5 billion a year from the National Institute of Health, one of the crown jewels that the American people own. $4.5 billion. If I had time, I'd go through the diseases which we are on the cusp of dealing with, from Alzheimer's to certain kinds of cancers to rare diseases. You probably remember the headlines during the government shutdown. Clinical trials funded at the National Institute of Health had to stop taking new patients, including children with cancer in these trials. Does that make sense? In an economy that's well almost $2 trillion. Well, the Ryan budget would mean fewer clinical trials, fewer opportunities for potential life-saving treatment and medical breakthroughs at a time, as I said, we're on the cusp of unlocking secrets of Alzheimer's and designing drug treatments to match the genetic structure of different types of cancer. I was meeting with some cancer experts from MD Anderson and from Jefferson Hospital. You know what they say this will do? An entire generation of brilliant young scientists will be lost. Those of you who are science majors, those of you who want to go on to graduate school, you go into this research area only if you can afford to get a grant to do the research. If you don't go in, we literally lose a generation. The 15% cut in the National Science Foundation. That's $1 billion cut in the National Science Foundation. What that would do is eliminate 2,400 research grants, like the one that gave us 3D printing or touchscreen typing and so many other things I could name. And maybe equally astounding is this new Republican Party, they no longer believe in investing in infrastructure. When Congressman Ryan introduced this budget, and you know the votes, they've constantly voted against investing in infrastructure, he said, and I quote, "Every time you hear the word investments, just know what it means. Take from hardworking taxpayers." Well, let me tell you what it means. It means when you fail to invest, you are putting America behind almost every other leading country in the world. When you cut funding for highways, it means more congestion, less productivity, millions of hours of productivity lost. When you refuse to modernize our ports to accommodate these new super Panamax ships that are going to be going through the Panama Canal, you take vast opportunities in trade to make it cheaper and more efficient because you don't modernize the ports out of the hands of American manufacturers. When you refuse to modernize airports, it means we fall behind. We lose competitive advantage. Why do people invest around the world? When you don't repair the bridges in that small town, you cut the town's economy off, you destroy commerce. And it's absolutely ironic to me that this is coming from the party with such an incredible history and leadership in investment in infrastructure. President Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. He launched the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, so-called DARPA, which has done so many things, including helping creating the internet. President Nixon invested in medical research as part of his war on cancer. So I said, this is not your father's Republican Party. I could go on what George H.W. Bush did. We have a fundamentally different view on what constitutes a vibrant, strong, growing America. We know for us to be the leading economic power in the world, we can't have a second-rate infrastructure that's less reliable, takes more time to get products to market in other countries. We know that refusing to invest in major innovation will put us behind other nations who are making massive investments in this area. Do you think China is not investing in infrastructure? Do you think the other major countries in the world are not investing in infrastructure? What do you hear most when you hear about why China is going to lead? They talk about the massive investment in infrastructure they've made. Look, we know we have the most skilled workforce in the world. We know that we have to ensure that no one who is working full-time has to raise a family in poverty. It's basic. It's time to restore this basic bargain. There's nothing radical about it. It's just straightforward. As I said, it's the history of the journey of the country. This basic bargain. You play by the rules, you're responsible for increasing productivity and profit. You should help share in that prosperity. Look, folks, that's what made us a world leader through the 21st century. That's what gave us such incredible stability. And that's what will make the 21st century ours. When given a chance, the American people have never, ever, ever, ever let their country down. Just give it a chance, an even chance. We have the possibility of creating a future with unlimited prosperity. We are better positioned than any nation in the world. Our workforce, according to a number of studies, is 3 times as productive as China. 54% of America's CEOs that are invested in China, every year the survey is done, 54% say they're considering bringing their operations back to the United States of America from China. We have courts that can be trusted. We respect intellectual property. We have the finest research institutions in the world. Our students, researchers, and professors are consistently challenging orthodoxy, which is the only way change happens. I say to the provost, I've made a lot of trips lately, over close to 900,000 miles, but I was in Singapore. And I met with a guy named Lee Kuan Yew, a really brilliant older man. And he wrote a lot on China, India, the United States, and Russia, and predicting their futures. And he was 92, I think, and he's very frail. And he sat there. I was flattered he'd give me the meeting. And I asked him, I said, what is China doing now? He said, he speaks perfect English. He said, Mr. Vice President, they're in the United States trying to find the black box. It's a quote. And I looked at him. I said, the black box? He said, yes. That box that contains the secret that allows America to continually renew itself, unlike any other nation in the world. And I said, it's presumptuous of me, Mr. President, but I think I know what's in that black box. This was the actual conversation. He said, what do you think's in the black box? I said, 2 things. It's stamped in the DNA of every American, naturalized or otherwise, to be able to challenge orthodoxy. Think about it. As bad as our system may be of education, no child is ever reprimanded for challenging orthodoxy, unlike any other country in the world, including our European friends. That's why we constantly break through, unlike any other nation in the world. Any other nation in the world. I want China to succeed. I have a very personal relationship with President Xi. I want them to succeed. I really do. But I've been making speeches at graduations since 1996 saying the Chinese have educated 6 times as many engineers and scientists as we have, et cetera. And it's true. Name me one worldwide product that is stamped saying made in China. Name me one. That is a consequential breakthrough. Name me one. North America is about to become the epicenter of energy production for the world in the 21st century. By the time you are out and having children, it will no longer be the Middle East. North America will be the epicenter of energy production. Even now, natural gas costs less than half of what it costs in Europe and a third of what it costs in Korea, Japan, and China. And according to a recent study, for the first time in more than a decade, CEOs around the world have declared the United States is the #1 place in the world to invest. So what are we afraid of? What are we doing? I've had the privilege of meeting literally every major world leader in the last 35 years, not because I'm important, because of the nature of my job. Seriously, running the Foreign Relations Committee and but I've met everyone. There may be 1 or 2 I cannot think of. But ladies and gentlemen, as I've traveled the world many times over, I can assure you, I've never met a single solitary leader of another country who wouldn't want to trade places with the President of the United States of America. Not once. Not one. The problems we face pale in comparison. I want Europe to succeed. I want Asia to succeed. It's good for us if they do. It's important that they do. But my Lord, the idea that somehow China's eating our lunch or Europe and the EU is, I mean, come on. Now is time to invest in America, to rebuild its infrastructure, its education system, its research, development, manufacturing, and technology. Now is the time. We are positioned. I got elected when I was 29 years old, as I said, and I was listed as an optimist. I can honestly say I am more optimistic about your future today than the day I took office about my generation. I really am. There's so much that is just over the horizon. As my mother would say, mark my words, it really is about to explode for the good. That's how we start to rebuild the middle class. Focus on what our strengths are and the basic bargain that helped grow this country for so many years. You know, and it's my view, until we stop rewarding unearned income over earned income, until we stop rewarding inherited wealth over hard work, we're not going to be able to restore that bargain. Folks, the middle class has been through enough. It's time for the budget to give them a fair shot. And the Republican budget does not. I believe ours does. You know, I know this all can seem, because you're in the midst of Washington, you're probably one of the most sophisticated college groups that I could speak to. Really, I mean, you're not only bright, but you're in the midst of this. It's hard. It's like living in Hollywood and not knowing the entertainment industry. You know, I mean, although this is becoming more entertainment than what we. But you really know, and there, you know, if I were you, I'd sit there and say, well, this just seems like another political speech, another political fight in Washington, battling over the budget again, the next standoff for the next election, red meat to stir up the troops. It's not. Don't give in to the cynicism here. Don't fall into the trap that none of this really matters, or there isn't much of a difference we can make. Years ago, there was a joke in the United States Senate when someone would give an impassioned speech, someone else would turn and say, that guy acts like this is on the level. Well, this is on the level, folks. This is on the level. This is deadly serious. This is about real people. If one of those folks who your only hope is one of those trials at NIH, this is no game. If you're 55 years old and you've planned your entire retirement on Medicare being there for you and Social Security, this is not an ideological battle. This is not a game. If your kid growing up in the heartland of America who has to compete with China and India and the rest of the world, education cuts aren't just another choice you make when you're dealing with a budget. You know, for 36 years, I took the train back and forth to Wilmington, Delaware, round trip every day. I did it to be close to my kids, but I had another benefit. It kept me awful close to people. The commuters I got to know, the conductors who became my friend and spent Christmas at my home, the folks at the train station. Every time I get off the train station, I'd be leaving. When I was actually going in the morning, the shoe shine guys, an old friend of mine, would yell, Joe, what the hell are you doing today? And expect an answer. But it was a constant reminder every single day that what we did mattered. It matters to individual people. Folks, we have to decide. Are we going to deal the middle class back into this bargain, or aren't we? Or you may conclude there's no way to deal them back in, no matter what we do. And that presents an entire different set of problems to face. Are we going to make it possible for the American people who do the work and are responsible for the explosion in productivity? Are we going to once again let them share in the benefits that flow from their work? A simple question. Are we going to restore the bargain? My dad, God love him, was a high school educated guy and a graceful gentleman, used to say, I don't expect the government to give me anything, but I do expect them to understand my problem. Ask yourself. Ask yourself whether the budget we're proposing and they're proposing demonstrates whether we understand the problem of average, hard-working American people. When I grew up and things, my dad was on hard times. That's how I got to Delaware. He lost it. He didn't lose, but he didn't have a job that could support the family. So he took off for a year, came home every weekend. But he said with certainty, Joey, it's going to be okay. I was going in the 4th grade. I remember sitting on the end of the bed. It's going to be okay. And when I have a good job, I'm going to send for you and Mom. I'll come home and get you guys, and everything's going to be okay. He believed it. Go into the old neighborhood your parents grew up in. Ask the 45-year-old guy and woman raising their kids whether they think it's going to be okay. Ask him. Ask them whether they think it's on the level. Not a joke. Ask them. Not who they're for, Democrat, Republican. Ask them. Barack and I are all about one thing, and we should, and you should be about one thing. Putting the American people in the middle class back in the position where they can turn and look at their kids and say, honey, it's going to be okay, and mean it. It's time for us to give them a shot because the American people are so much better. They're so much smarter. They're so much stronger. They take so much more responsibility than our friends on the other side give them credit for. They're not the givers and the takers. They're getting up every morning, putting one foot in front of the other and wondering whether their kid's going to have the same shot they had. As I said before, and I'll say it again, to you, to the Republicans, to all the foreign leaders throughout the world I've ever met, never, never, never bet against the American people. It's always been a bad bet. God bless you all. Thank you.